However, spatial planning has the duty of ensuring an ordered and soil-conserving settlement of the land. In order to achieve this, the building zones which are already built up today must be utilised in a better way. That includes the reactivation of derelict land and better utilisation of locations well connected to public transport. This is an extremely challenging task. Bernd Scholl is Professor for Spatial Development at the Institute for Spatial and Landscape Development at the ETH Zurich. For many years, he's been researching how to design processes which would leverage inward urban development.
In 2014, the revised Spatial Planning Act came into force, requiring inward urban development ahead of outward development as a strategy for future settlement development. As a result, communities will have to direct both their quantitative and qualitative growth to already built-up areas. This represents a paradigm change in the spatial planning practice for many communities in Switzerland. In the past, usage conflicts and requests were solved by moving into the land, resulting in what is commonly known as suburbanization. Inward urban development can no longer ensue based on proven processes for settlement area expansion. Instead, future utilization based on special procedures, as well as the interaction of key stakeholders, must be jointly negotiated. One possible solution is the application of test planning procedures. Test planning is part of the informal cooperative planning procedures, thereby supplementing formal ones. Test planning lends itself to strategically significant tasks with particularly difficult and complex challenges, particularly in exploring the fundamental options available to take action in light of a far-reaching problem in a specific space. Such spaces include the center zones in cities and communities, and issues relating to spatial and infrastructure development on a regional scale. Tasks in a cross-border context are particularly challenging. Or, as in the case of Attisholz, the conversion of a former industrial area with an astonishing size of over 100 hectares, making it one of the largest available land reserves in all of Switzerland.
Es gehört damit zu den größten verfügbaren Landreserven, die wir in der Schweiz finden.
The test planning method is based on approaches attempted during the 1970s in Vienna. It was developed after the devastating Danube floods, when the first kilometer of the flood protection dam was visited, a massive engineering structure with standard section. This standard cross-section and standard dam would have rendered the utilization of the Danube area impossible for other purposes. Planners in Vienna quickly realized that their traditional planning methods would not suffice, resulting in a process innovation. At the heart of these procedural innovations are regular meetings under conclave-like conditions for 1 week, with all significant stakeholders under the chairmanship of independent experts.
Unter dem Vorsitz unabhängiger Experten.
Over a period of 3 years, a lead project was created to serve as foundation for all future work. The central idea was to create the central recreational area for the population of Vienna with little extra costs for pure flood protection. For this purpose, it was necessary to optimally integrate the area into the public transport. These plans became reality. Today, more than 300,000 people visit the Danube area and island on nice days. This procedural innovation has become known as the Viennese model. Other challenges, however, soon showed that the costs associated with the Viennese model were too high.
Wiener Modell verbundener Aufwand zu groß war.
The approach was therefore improved and time frames reduced. Test planning now generally lasts 1 year, with another year for possible concentration.
Ein weiteres Jahr für eine eventuelle Vertiefung. Taktgeber.
The procedure still consists of regular meetings under conclave-like conditions, but shorter in duration. One-day meetings are generally sufficient for the test planning procedure. It is then finalized in a 2-day meeting, during which conclusions are drawn and developed into recommendations. From a scientific perspective, test planning originates with the science theorist Karl Popper, who incidentally was from Vienna. He stated, "We must formulate bold hypotheses and then expose them to the fire of criticism." Competition is intended to enable the best ideas to prove their worth in the crossfire of criticism. This is fundamental, as most far-reaching errors are made in the initial phase of planning, because an important factor to solve the problem was forgotten or consciously or unconsciously overlooked. Qualified and qualitative criticism, despite the size of the challenge of dealing with it, and critical reflection, together with team ideas, thus form the essence of the procedure. This results in fruitful learning processes. Similarities with academic learning processes, in which criticism, critical thinking, and actions are key factors when seeking a solution, cannot be denied.
An exemplary implementation of test planning in Switzerland occurred starting in 2011 in the community area of Riedholz and Luterbach, then the largest derelict land in the country. Years earlier, the centre of Swiss cellulose and paper production was located here.
Die Geschichte des Areals beginnt in den 1800.
The history of the area dates back to the 1880s, when a German chemist by the name of Benjamin Sieber settled at the banks of the Aare River and focused on the industrial production of chemically manufactured cellulose. The company was family-owned for more than 100 years, at one point with a workforce of more than 1,000.
Das zwischenzeitlich dann über 1.000 Arbeitnehmer beschäftigt hat. Ende 90er, Anfang 2000er Jahre.
In the late 1990s and beginning of the 2000s, the company and area were sold, and the name of the company changed multiple times. It was finally acquired by the Norwegian Beauregard Group in 2002-2003, who showed up to 2008 that a sustainable industrial production of cellulose was not feasible at this location for economic reasons.
Aus wirtschaftlichen Gründen nicht sinnvoll möglich ist.
First of all, I think some external factors changed in quite significant way. Raw material cost, which is mainly wood, went up quite significantly. Energy cost went up. Then there were some internal factors. We saw that the total layout of the design was not ideal, so it would give us some challenges when we implemented this strategy. And then we also had a more competitive situation in the market that we had foreseen. And then finally, I would also mention the environmental situation, which turned out to be much more challenging than we expected at the time of the takeover. And so we saw that we would be struggling to meet the limits for effluents from the operation, and this would only become worse when we specialized the mill. So then in the end, in the summer of 2008, it became clear to us that the only option would really be to close down the operation.
Man darf nicht vergessen, ein Unternehmen.
It must not be forgotten. A company at one point employing more than 1,000 people and still with a workforce of 450 when it shut down. made its mark in the region. It was significant for the small canton of Solothurn and the determining factor in shaping the village of Reitholz for more than 100 years. And yet, all at once, it was all over? Naturally, the reactions ranged from shock and skepticism to fear within the community. What do we do now? What is going to happen to us? At the canton level, we all sensed that the villagers were uncertain. What it would now mean if all at once this area was no longer being used by an industrial plant.
Schwindende Margen, große Investitionen.
Dwindling margins, large-scale investments in environmental technologies, which would have to be improved. And then it happened what always happens. A large area with its history, with generations of employees from the same families, changed hands quickly, multiple times. And we were worried that it would simply perish.
Mitarbeitenden, die aus der gleichen Familie immer hier waren, dass auch das noch untergeht.
Looking back, I also find it a good example of where these typical conflicts can arise. The importance of the company, the economic importance, as well as the political importance. Nobody wanted to be the one to officially bury such an enterprise, while on the other hand, all these statutory framework conditions and the reactions from the local population
The mood in the area was quite aggressive. When the closure was announced, there were demonstrations, a desolate situation. The government was immediately confronted with questions. What do you intend to do now? Now you have what you wanted. So we also had to defend ourselves against getting the buck passed and remind people that there are laws, which in the end have to be complied with.
Es gibt Gesetze und letztendlich sind diese halt einzuhalten.
When it comes to the position of the Norwegian owners and operators, after deciding that the closure was inevitable, they never blamed the canton for having contributed to the downfall of the company.
Nie den Vorwurf gemacht, habe zum Niedergang der Firma eigentlich beigetragen. Die Situation nach der Schließung von Borregaard.
The situation after the closure was actually quite spooky, one might say. Derelict land encompassing over 300 hectares was created practically overnight.
Industriebrache in der Größe von über 100 Hektaren.
Für dieses Areal war vor allem das Amt für Umwelt.
The Office for the Environment, in particular, was preoccupied with this area, primarily dealing with issues of noise pollution, air pollution and wastewater. For us, from the perspective of the Cantonal Office for Spatial Planning, it was actually the significance of the location in terms of the size of the industrial zone, today's industrial zone, and the possible potentials.
Und der möglichen Potenziale. Und dann kam natürlich die Frage,
naturally, we posed the question, what do we do with such an area? Is there anybody with experience of an area of 100 hectares? The next step was to get all the key stakeholders on board to discuss what to do with it. The political authorities in the canton had to be dealt with, the administration had to deal with other administrative bodies, the community had to be involved, and ultimately the most important aspect, we had to convince the owners of the land that something unusual had to happen here.
Was nicht der Normalfall ist.
Es gibt kein Patentrezept oder keinen idealen Weg.
There is no patent remedy or ideal path for communities to develop strategies for inward urban development or to solve the problems involved. Each location is unique and therefore requires individual solutions, which we refer to as customization. These tasks are less solved by providing a series of assessment to individual offices and possibly counter-assessments if dealing with particularly controversial projects than by well-designed procedures in which the key stakeholders get together to develop the solution through regular communication and exchange.
Finden und dann in einem geregelten Austausch die Lösung erarbeiten.
Beide Gemeinden wären
Neither of the communities, either working alone or together, would have been capable of realizing a planning plant of this scale, as they were well aware. The canton possesses, in certain cases, and from a certain size, the option to undertake cantonal planning, where the communities would bear the primary responsibility. These communities, though, have to be willing to participate.
Test planning. This was a sealed book for me, but this was at a time when nobody yet knew who will actually participate. Are the communities involved? In what form? Who is on board? And what is the actual purpose here?
And the communities, our communities, but most likely all the communities in the country, would only join in if they had enough confidence. It is only the government that can create confidence in such cases.
Actually, I was relieved when the canton became involved and approached us about test planning. After all, this took some of the pressure off us as the planning agency of the community. And even though nobody in the communal council knew what test planning was, they were indeed familiar with the test planning timeframe and the associated budget.
Testplanung vonstatten geht und mit welchem Budgetbetrag man sich beteiligen muss daran.
It was not obvious that it was going to be planned or that we were going forward with the planning, because at that moment in time it was mainly focusing on the closure.
When we looked at the location, when we bought the company, it was more from an industrial perspective. Supply of wood, utilities, raw material, transportation, that sort of thing, from an industrial perspective. And then it became a real estate development project.
Wir waren damals noch keine
At that time, we did not think like large-scale landowners. We were industrials dealing with our own topics. So it naturally took a while until we somehow learned to speak the same language.
wo die gleiche Sprache gefunden hat.
Für mich
It is clear to me from the beginning that the canton would not be able to solve these tasks with conventional instruments alone, particularly from a planning perspective. The area was too big, the expectations too high, and our means too small.
Die Erwartungen zu hoch und unsere Mittel zu klein.
And that is how the following idea quickly emerged. And, as I checked again, it came from the Office for Spatial Planning. We would have to consider a procedure, an open procedure, well supported in the form of test planning.
Das gut abgestützt ist in der Form einer Testplanung ins Auge fassen.
At that moment, it was essential to be able to draw on a network which you can develop, say, during postgraduate studies at the ETH. And I was able to access this network, contacted Professor Bernd Scholl, and described the initial situation to him. Back during our training, we had already discussed test planning, the key word here being the Viennese model. But for this test planning, you cannot simply go to a canton and start test planning, as these are special situations. And it was clear from the very beginning that someone would have to take the lead, and that would be the landowner. This is why it was clear from the beginning that we would visit the owners to make them understand that enormous possibilities could result from this closure.
Dass eigentlich ein großes Potenzial in dieser Stilllegung drin liegt.
Testplanung was not something that we initiated. It was introduced to us by the canton. It was not obvious from the beginning that we would go for it. And on the other hand, we knew that the site was so big, developing it would be very complex. So we wanted to, first of all, to do a proper job in closing it down and without spills and environmental problems and so on. But then also in parallel we started to see how can we realize the value which is there. And even better if we could start a process where this site could be turned into something new.
Also die Idee, dass die damaligen Eigentümer
The idea that the then owners would simply unload the land was not really that far-fetched. Our head of spatial planning, Bernard Staub, once said in a certain framework and context, yes, the planning zone instrument does still exist. If you move too fast for us and simply sell the land to anyone, we still have the means at our disposal to prevent you from doing so.
Dass das Land quasi an irgendjemanden veräußert, dann haben wir auch noch Mittel und Wege, es zu verhindern.
Für mich war spannend, weil wir
It was exciting for me because we came and only presented the benefits of cooperative planning. It was clear that we were carrying a positive message to motivate you to participate. But we also made clear that we also held the planning zone threat in reserve. If the landowner doesn't cooperate, the canton has the right to decree a planning zone for 3 or 5 years. And then nothing happens. This is why our concept met with open ears to jointly initiate cooperative planning, meaning test planning.
gemeinsam anzugehen.
Die in Anführungszeichen
Of course, the threat of the planning zone showed us that although we were the landowners, we would also have to bear the associated risks and costs. Ultimately, however, it is not us but the community and the canton who are the planning authority. That made us aware, as it were, how such a process needs to be structured so that all the parties involved can say yes to something in the end.
Wie so ein Prozess aufgebaut sein muss, damit eigentlich alle Beteiligten am Schluss zu etwas Ja sagen können.
The Testplanung, the fact that it started and it was organized the way it was and conducted the way it was, can be seen as a very good starting of a process, because the risk was, I think, that there could be a deadlock. It was a huge area. No one knew really what it would be used for, and probably for different uses. And then there were pollution problems, there were different zonungen and so on. So I think there was a risk that nothing could happen for a long time. And I think this started the whole team marching. And also that all the interested parties were represented there. I mean, we as landowners, and then the canton, different Fachstellen in the canton, politicians, and also what I call the civil society, other interested parties, stakeholders in the area, of course the Gemeinden, who were key in this process, and also the fact that an external academic like Professor Scholl was chairing it. I think this whole setup brought a dynamic which was quite important, and maybe a paradox. It appeared that it would be a very time-consuming process with all of these steps, but at the same time, I think exactly the fact that the whole team started marching meant, when you look back, that a lot of things happened still in a relatively short time.
Als Resultat erhalten die Auftraggeber von
As a result, test planning will provide the contractors with the most promising solution in the given situation. This is how it was in Attisholz. The competition of ideas in the test planning method exhibits parallels to democracy, which essentially also represents a competition of ideas. That may be the reason that Switzerland, with its structure of direct democracy, has provided fertile soil for the test planning approach. Today, it is the country with the strongest tradition in the application of this procedure.
Die weitaus stärkste Tradition im Einsatz mit diesen Verfahren aufweist.